I think that if I would have never came to death row, I wouldn't be the individual I am today. I wouldn't be as mature. I wouldn't be able to explain to my daughter's life, the appreciation of it, because I didn't have any appreciation for life.
Christopher Anthony Young lay awake in his cell on the night of July 16, 2018, staring at the concrete ceiling above him. He was 34 years old, but in less than 24 hours he would be gone. Not because of illness, not because of war, but because the state of Texas had marked the exact date and time they planned to kill him. For years, he had prepared for this moment, but the reality of his own countdown was still unbearable. Every sound echoed louder, every second seemed heavier, and every memory of mistakes, of pain, of fleeting joys came rushing back like a flood. He wasn't the same 21-year-old who had walked into a convenience store more than a decade earlier and fired a gun that ended the life of Hasmukh Patel, a husband, father, and community man. Back then, Christopher was lost, angry, intoxicated, drowning in trauma and violence. On that day, one reckless act changed everything. A family shattered, a community enraged, and his own fate sealed. Texas prosecutors pursued the death penalty from the start, and a jury delivered it swiftly. That decision began a slow, agonizing countdown to this night. But prison changed him. Over the years, Christopher became a different man. No longer a gang member, no longer the addict, no longer the reckless youth who thought he was invincible. He found religion. He found peace. He mentored younger inmates, spoke against the very life he once embraced, and became a father again through letters and phone calls. Even guards on death row testified to his transformation. Yet none of that mattered now. In the eyes of the state, change had come too late. Just hours earlier, he had stood before the Texas Parole Board, not begging, but challenging. He argued that justice was not even-handed, pointing out that white inmates with worse crimes had been granted clemency. He pleaded not just for himself, but for his daughters, who would grow up fatherless. His words fell on deaf ears. The board voted unanimously. Execution would go forward. Now, in the darkness of his cell, Christopher prepared to die, not as the young man who took a life, but as someone who had finally discovered his own. The tragedy was not only in what he had done, but in what he might have become. On the morning of November 21, 2004, San Antonio began its Sunday the way it always did. Quiet streets, cool air, and the steady rhythm of a city slowly waking up. Inside a small convenience store on the east side, Hasmukh Patel, a 55-year-old immigrant, husband and father, was starting his day. To his community, Mr. Patel wasn't just a shopkeeper. He was a man who worked tirelessly to build a better life for his family, the kind of person who greeted every customer with patience and kindness. His store wasn't just a business, it was his dream in motion. But at 9:30 a.m., that dream collided with a storm. Christopher Young, just 21 years old, stumbled through the door. He hadn't slept in days. His body was running on alcohol, cocaine, and adrenaline. His mind was scattered, volatile, and dangerously unstable. He carried a handgun tucked beneath his jacket, not with a plan, not with a clear motive, but with years of grief, rage, and chaos pressing down on him all at once. What unfolded wasn't a robbery in the traditional sense. There was no demand for money, no getaway plan, no cold calculation. What Christopher brought into that store was everything unresolved in his young life. The anger from losing his father at 8 years old, the years of gang life, the addiction that drowned his mind. All of it manifested in one desperate, destructive moment. Mr. Patel sensed the danger immediately. Calmly, he raised his hands, his voice steady, trying to diffuse the tension. He wasn't combative, he wasn't resisting. He was simply a man caught in a storm he did not deserve. Then it happened. A single deafening shot echoed through the small store. The bullet struck Patel in the chest. Within minutes, his breath was gone, and with him, the stability of a family that depended on him. Christopher didn't take a dollar. He didn't shout or threaten. He fled, stumbling into the street, the sound of the gunshot ringing in his ears. Witnesses saw him running, disoriented and sweating, and police caught up with him the same day, just blocks away. When they found him, he was sitting on a curb, shaking his head, muttering apologies he couldn't take back. In the interrogation room, the truth spilled out. He confessed. He admitted he had been drunk, high, and lost. He told detectives he didn't even remember pulling the trigger, but the damage was irreversible. A husband and father was gone, a family left broken, and for Christopher, there was no turning back. The state of Texas made its position clear. This wasn't just a killing, it was capital murder, and they would pursue the maximum penalty. That morning, in a single flash of violence, two families' lives were shattered forever. For the Patels, it was the loss of a loved one. For Christopher Young's daughters, it marked the beginning of a countdown that would one day end on a gurney in Huntsville. Before his name was linked forever to tragedy, Hasmukh Patel was simply a man chasing the same dream that draws so many to America, the hope of building a life through hard work, faith, and dignity. Born in India, Patel came to the United States with his wife and children in search of stability. For him, owning a small convenience store in San Antonio wasn't just a way to make a living. It was proof that his sacrifices meant something, that his family could stand on solid ground in a new country. Every morning, Patel opened his doors before sunrise, greeting neighbors with a quiet smile, remembering their names, their routines, their preferences. His shop became a small but vital part of the community. People didn't just stop by for groceries. They came because Patel made them feel seen, respected, and welcomed. He believed in karma, in peace, in the idea that honesty and service were the foundations of a good life. But on that November morning in 2004, the values Patel lived by were met with chaos. One pull of a trigger, one senseless act, ended decades of sacrifice. He collapsed behind the counter of the very store he had built with his own hands. And in that moment, his family's world was destroyed. His wife became a widow, his children fatherless, and the community lost a man they trusted. In the days that followed, grief weighed heavy. Friends and neighbors gathered at the Patel home, bringing food, prayers, and tears. They remembered his kindness, his laughter, and his devotion to family. But no words could fill the silence left behind. For his wife and children, the loss was permanent, and the cruel irony was that Patel had left India seeking safety, only to die violently in the very place he believed would protect them. Years later, when Christopher Young's execution date was set, the story took an unexpected turn. Patel's son, Mitesh Patel, stood before the Texas Parole Board and publicly opposed the execution. He argued that killing Christopher would not bring his father back, nor would it honor the values his father lived by. In his words, "My father was a man of forgiveness. I do not believe in taking a life for a life." His plea was powerful, rare, and deeply human. But the board did not waver. The execution moved forward despite the victim's own family asking for mercy. And so Patel's legacy became more than just the story of his death. It became a story of forgiveness, of a son refusing to let violence define his father's memory. Christopher Anthony Young was not born into peace. He entered the world in San Antonio in 1983, in a family already stretched thin by hardship. His childhood carried two constants: a sharp, curious mind, and an environment heavy with violence and instability. Teachers would later describe him as unusually bright. He could pick up a violin and reproduce a melody after hearing it only once, or move chess pieces with the calm calculation of a natural strategist. Beneath the surface of poverty and struggle, there was real talent, even brilliance. But talent needs stability to grow, and stability never came. When Christopher was just 8 years old, his father was shot and killed. That moment split his world in two. A child who should have been protected was instead forced to face grief he couldn't process. His father's death didn't just wound the family, it detonated it. Without the man who might have set boundaries, provided guidance, and anchored the household, chaos moved in. Grief turned to anger, and anger demanded an outlet. In neighborhoods like Christopher's, the streets are quick to fill the void that families cannot. By the time he was 12, the Bloods gang had claimed him. A red bandana became his shield, the street code his new textbook. For Christopher, it wasn't about glamour or rebellion, it was survival. The gang offered what he thought he needed: protection, identity, and a sense of belonging. But the cost was high. Childhood innocence slipped away, replaced by rules that punished weakness and rewarded violence. School became irrelevant. Algebra and literature felt meaningless compared to dodging rivals, hustling on corners, and proving himself to older gang members. By ninth grade, Christopher dropped out, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the weight of survival felt more urgent than any classroom lesson. His teachers would later say he was one of the brightest minds they'd seen, but brilliance without guidance is fragile. His violin fell silent. His chessboard gathered dust, and his life began to spiral into the same cycle that had claimed so many young men before him. Petty crime led to arrests, arrests led to juvenile lockups, lockups hardened him further. With every scrape against the system, the possibility of rehabilitation shrank. The courts were investing in Christopher's potential. They were preparing to contain him. By the time he turned 18, his path was set: gang loyalty, addiction, and the ever-present threat of violence. From the outside, it was easy to label him another statistic, another young black man who had chosen the streets over school. But that view ignored everything Christopher never chose: the loss of a father, the absence of healing, the lure of survival in a world built on trauma and poverty. By the time he realized what those choices had cost him, it was already too late. His childhood was gone, his gifts buried, and the streets had swallowed what might have been. By 2006, Christopher Young was no longer just another young man from San Antonio. He was now the defendant in a capital murder trial, facing the most serious charge the state of Texas could bring. From the beginning, the prosecution made their intentions clear. They were seeking the death penalty. Inside the Bexar County courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. On one side sat the Patel family, grieving and silent. On the other sat Christopher, only 22 years old, dressed in a suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. Between them stretched the gulf of tragedy. One life taken, another life on the line. The prosecution painted Christopher as a hardened gang member, a man who had chosen violence as his way of life. They detailed his juvenile arrests, his ties to the Bloods, his history of drugs and fights. To the jury, they framed him as dangerous, irredeemable, a threat that could never be safely contained in prison. They pointed to the surveillance footage, the eyewitness accounts, and most damning of all, his own confession. Their case was straightforward. This was not only murder, it was capital murder, and the punishment must be death. The defense had little room to maneuver. They did not deny that Christopher pulled the trigger. Instead, they tried to explain the life behind the act. They spoke of a boy who had lost his father to violence at just 8 years old, a child swallowed by trauma and never given the tools to heal. They highlighted his intelligence, his musical talent, the flashes of potential that had been buried beneath addiction and survival. They reminded the jury that Christopher had been drunk and high, not in control of himself that morning, and pleaded that his youth should be considered. That at 21, he was still more boy than man. But in the eyes of the jury, none of that outweighed the crime. A husband and father was dead, and the community demanded justice. The prosecutors closed with a simple, chilling argument. In Texas, killers die. The deliberation was brief. After just 2 hours, the jury returned with their decision. Christopher Anthony Young was guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. The courtroom fell silent. There were no shouts, no tears, only the weight of inevitability pressing down on everyone in the room. Christopher did not lash out. He did not break down. He sat quietly, staring forward, as if the outcome had been decided long before the trial even began. For the Patel family, it was a moment of justice, though one that could never bring their loved one back. For Christopher's family, it was the beginning of a long, painful countdown. From that day on, Christopher's life no longer belonged to him. Shackled, loaded into a van, and driven to the Polunsky Unit, Texas's notorious death row, he entered a world where time itself became his harshest warden. The trial was over, but the real sentence, the slow unraveling of years in isolation, was just beginning. When Christopher Young first arrived at the Polunsky Unit in early 2006, he braced himself for war. He expected the same violence and chaos that had defined his years on the streets. Fights between gangs, stabbings in the yard, and constant battles for respect. Instead, he found something he had never experienced before: silence. Death row at Polunsky was not a battlefield. It was a concrete box, 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. A steel door, a narrow bed, and endless time to think. For Christopher, that silence was unbearable at first. He shouted into it, punched walls, dropped to the floor for push-ups until his arms gave out. He cursed the system, cursed himself, cursed life itself. In those early months, the anger that had consumed him for so long came pouring out, with nowhere to go. Then, slowly, something changed. On death row, gang colors didn't matter. Nobody cared about the Bloods. Nobody cared about reputation. The silence stripped those things away, leaving only the man beneath. And it was there, in that isolation, that Christopher met Reginald Blanton, a fellow inmate from San Antonio who carried himself differently. Reginald wasn't bitter. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was calm, centered, grounded in something Christopher didn't yet understand. One day, Reginald slipped a book under Christopher's door, As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. At first, Christopher dismissed it. It was thin, old-fashioned, written in a style that seemed out of place in prison. But as he read, the words cut deeper than he expected. A man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts. For the first time, Christopher realized that his life, the pain, the anger, the choices, was not just random chaos. It was a pattern, and patterns could be broken. From there, the transformation began. Reginald gave him more books and they exchanged notes, debating ideas through the cracks in their doors. Christopher learned to breathe through anger, to pause before reacting, to see himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man responsible for his choices. Reginald became a mentor, a mirror, a brother. And when the state of Texas executed Reginald in 2009, Christopher made a promise. He would not let that be the end of what his friend had taught him. Over the years, he began mentoring younger inmates, helping them avoid the same mistakes. He talked men down from fights, sometimes through the prison vents. Guards noticed the change. He was no longer a troublemaker, but a peacemaker. He wrote letters to schools, youth programs, anyone who would listen. He proposed a curriculum called Reaching Our Young from the Inside Out, designed to steer kids away from the life that had destroyed his own. Christopher had entered death row as an angry young gang member, consumed by violence and addiction. But by the time he faced his final years, he had become something else entirely. A teacher, a mentor, a man who had finally found peace in the unlikeliest of places. Yet no matter how much he changed, the system did not change with him. In Texas, redemption is not enough to stop the clock. For more than a decade, Christopher Young lived in the narrow space between life and death, filing appeal after appeal while the clock ticked toward execution. His lawyers argued that his death sentence was unfair, not because he denied the crime, but because the punishment was not applied equally. They pointed to a pattern in Texas. When defendants were white, even those guilty of crimes far more brutal, the justice system seemed willing to consider mercy. But for Christopher, a young black man, the path was rigid and final. The most striking comparison came just months before Christopher's scheduled execution. In February 2018, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously granted clemency to Thomas Bart Whitaker, a white man who had orchestrated the murders of his own mother and brother, nearly killing his father as well. Despite his crime being premeditated and devastating, Whitaker's life was spared, his sentence commuted to life in prison. Christopher's legal team seized on that decision, asking why he, a man who had demonstrated remorse, transformation, and even won the support of his victim's family, should be treated differently. It wasn't just his lawyers making the case. Activists, pastors, and community leaders rallied for him. But perhaps the most powerful voice was that of Mitesh Patel, the son of Hasmukh Patel. The man who had lost his father at Christopher's hands stood before the board and pleaded for his life. "Executing him won't honor my father's memory," he said. "My father was a man of peace, a man of forgiveness. This is not what he would have wanted." In a system often defined by vengeance, Mitesh's stance was rare and courageous. He believed that forgiveness could heal more than another death ever would. His words should have carried extraordinary weight, but the board listened and then turned away. On July 13, 2018, just 4 days before the scheduled execution, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles announced their decision. Unanimous. No clemency, no commutation, no second chance. For Christopher, the words might as well have been a second sentencing. Whatever he had become in prison, whatever redemption he had found, it was not enough. The denial underscored the very point he had tried to make. Justice was not even-handed. To Christopher, it was proof that race and circumstance shaped who lived and who died. "My life matters too," he had said, standing before the board. But in the cold language of bureaucracy, his plea was erased. Back in his cell at the Polunsky unit, the reality pressed in. Time was no longer measured in years or even months, it was measured in hours. And as those hours dwindled, the man Christopher had become, the mentor, the peacemaker, the father, would now face the one thing even transformation could not stop: the executioner's schedule. By the afternoon of July 16, 2018, the countdown was no longer measured in years or months. It was measured in hours. For Christopher Young, those final hours were not spent in violence or rage, but in the most human of ways, clinging to the last connections he had left. The visiting room at the Polunsky unit was unusually bright, its harsh fluorescent lights exposing every crease in his face, every line of age carved into the man who had once entered prison as a reckless 21-year-old. On this day, there was no thick glass barrier, no phone pressed to his ear. For the first time in years, Christopher was allowed to hold his daughter's hands. They were no longer little girls. Now teenagers, they carried themselves with a quiet strength, their fingers tightening around his, as if memorizing the shape of their father's hands. Beside them sat their mother, silent but steady. The conversation wasn't long, and it wasn't about the past. Christopher spoke softly, giving them advice he wished someone had once given him. Be better than me. Stay out of the streets. Use your gifts. Don't let the world tell you who you are. The girls didn't break down, didn't sob uncontrollably. Instead, their love came in the quiet squeeze of his fingers and the way they held his gaze, refusing to let him go until the guard said the visit was over. That night, back in his cell, the rituals of the execution process unfolded with cold precision. Dinner was served, not a special request, not the indulgent last meals often shown in movies, but the standard prison tray: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, corn, and a slice of bread. Texas had abolished last meal requests years earlier, after a condemned man mocked the tradition. For Christopher, the food wasn't what mattered. He chewed slowly, each bite heavy with the knowledge that it was the last thing he would ever taste. As the hours stretched into night, he wrote letters, unfinished messages to his daughters, to friends, to anyone who might remember him as more than his worst mistake. He prayed. He reflected. The silence of death row, which had once been unbearable, now became a space for final peace. In the early morning of July 17th, the guards began preparing him for transfer to Huntsville, where Texas carries out its executions. As chains clinked around his wrists and ankles, every sound was amplified. Every step, every shuffle of boots on concrete, carried the weight of finality. Christopher Young's last day on earth had begun. For a man who once believed he would die young in gang warfare, it was a bitter irony. He had survived the streets, survived prison, survived himself, only to walk steadily toward a death chosen not by fate, but by the state of Texas. The morning of July 17, 2018 began like no other, yet it carried the heaviest weight of Christopher Young's life. Transferred from the Polunsky unit to Huntsville, he entered the Walls unit, the place where Texas carries out its executions. The ride was short, but the sound of chains clinking with every movement made the journey feel endless. For Christopher, each echo was a reminder that the countdown was over. By evening, the witnesses had gathered. Behind a pane of glass stood reporters, state officials, spiritual advisors, and members of Hasmukh Patel's family. Among them was Patel's son Mitesh, who had spoken against the execution, but was now forced to watch the state carry it out in his father's name. The room was silent, except for the shuffle of boots on the chamber floor as Christopher was escorted in. He was laid down on the gurney, his arms strapped tightly, his head tilted just enough to face the witnesses. For a moment, his eyes closed as if bracing himself against the weight of the moment. Then, when asked if he had any final words, Christopher's voice broke through the silence. He addressed Mitesh Patel directly, thanking him for his forgiveness and compassion. He told his daughters he loved them, urging them to stay strong. He spoke of change, of remorse, of hope that his death might still serve some purpose. "I love you all. I taste it in my throat," he whispered, tears sliding from the corners of his eyes. Those were his final words. The warden gave the signal, and the process began. The first drug entered his veins, then the second, and finally the third. Christopher's breathing grew shallow. His body stiffened, then relaxed. The words he had just spoken seemed to linger in the chamber, hanging in the air long after his voice had gone quiet. At 6:38 p.m., the warden confirmed it. The sentence had been carried out. In that moment, two families carried the weight of loss. The Patels had already endured the unimaginable pain of losing a husband and father. Now Christopher's three daughters faced the rest of their lives without their own. No one left that room whole. For the state of Texas, it was another execution, one of hundreds carried out under its laws. For those who loved Christopher Young, it was the end of a man who had fallen, risen, and found redemption too late to save his own life. Christopher Young's story is not simple. It is not the story of a monster, nor is it the story of a saint. It is a story of contradictions, of brilliance lost to trauma, of violence born from pain, of redemption found too late to matter in a courtroom. On one side of the ledger sits the undeniable truth. A man named Hasmukh Patel, a father and husband, was senselessly taken from his family and his community. No words, no transformation, no act of remorse could ever undo that loss. But on the other side lies another truth. Christopher Young was not the same person who pulled the trigger in 2004. Years in isolation stripped away the bravado, the gang ties, the anger. In their place grew a man who mentored others, who preached accountability, who became a father again through letters and phone calls, who even earned the forgiveness of his victim's own son. His life became a testament to the possibility of change. And yet, the system did not bend. In Texas, the death penalty leaves no room for who you've become. It only remembers who you were at your worst. That rigidity raises haunting questions. If the purpose of prison is rehabilitation, what do we say when rehabilitation is achieved but ignored? If forgiveness can be offered by the family of the victim, why can't mercy be extended by the state? And if transformation is possible, does it matter at all when the system insists on finality? The tragedy of Christopher Young's story is not only in the crime he committed, nor solely in the punishment he received. It is in the ripple effect. The Patel family forced to endure grief, his daughters forced to grow up without a father, a community forced to question whether justice truly serves healing. It is in the silence that follows when redemption collides with a system built for punishment, not renewal. On July 17, 2018, at 6:38 p.m., Christopher Young's life ended on a gurney in Huntsville. But the questions his case raised remain very much alive. Can a man's worst act define him forever? Or can the possibility of change and the power of forgiveness ever be enough to break the cycle? In the end, his final breath carried both the weight of his crime and the fragile hope that someone else, somewhere, might choose differently. And so the story of Christopher Young comes to a close. A life marked by tragedy, by loss, by transformation that came too late. It leaves us with hard questions about justice, redemption, and the weight of choices that ripple through families and generations. But now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Christopher's change should have mattered? Should redemption ever play a role in life and death decisions? Or is justice only about the crime itself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters here. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. That way we can keep bringing you more stories that challenge, disturb, and reveal the deeper truths behind the headlines. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay thoughtful, stay aware, and stay safe.